All right, awesome. We are live now. So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Cheyenne. If you've been to these workshops before, you've seen me introduce these workshops and give one myself earlier. And yeah, but for this workshop for the Sui Liquid Staking Hackathon, we are joined today by Alonzo. He is the chief economist at Miston Labs, and today he will be going over staking and tokenomics on Sui. So if you're looking to build a liquid staking protocol, the content of this presentation will be probably very important to what you want to do. So without further ado, Alonzo, please take it away.
Thanks, Cheyenne. Really happy to be here. Very excited to talk with folks and talk about staking in Sui and other issues related to tokenomics. So what I was planning on doing for today is I created some slides that have, can everyone see this?
Yes, I can add it to this. Yes. And now you'll be able to go through them.
Okay, perfect. So what I created here is just a set of slides that have a lot of information on how staking works in Sui. Some of it is like somewhat technical, not in the sense of including code, but just in terms of like how the design of staking works in Sui. And I think it includes some of the major questions that people should be asking when they're attempting to build liquid staking. In addition to these questions that I'm going to go through today. I'm happy to take questions at the end and discuss other items that may not be in this presentation. And Cheyenne, we can share this presentation and have a lot of information that might be valuable for people. Okay, so giving a really quick overview about tokenomics in Sui. The Sui economy revolves basically around the Sui token. The Sui token is sort of the glue that makes sure that everything in Sui related to staking and just more general to tokenomics, gas, liquidity, governance, the storage fund is all aligned and sort of make sure that all the ecosystem participants, including the validators, the users, the people that hold the Sui token are sort of aligned with each other and can have a sustainable network from an economic perspective. And so the main items in terms of tokenomics in Sui are basically the gas mechanism, the staking mechanism, the storage fund, and some governance items. Now, since today we're going to talk about mainly liquid staking items, I'm going to delve very deeply into how staking works in Sui and not really talk about the other items. But you could always go to the Sui documentation website to read about the other items about Sui tokenomics, and there's also the Sui tokenomics white paper if you're interested in doing an even deeper dive. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about how the staking flow works in Sui. Just to start with some very basic questions. What is a staker? So in Sui, a staker is basically anyone with a Sui address that has some Sui tokens. And the way it works in Sui is that if you have some Sui tokens, you can delegate your voting power from those Sui tokens to any validator of choice directly from your wallet. And anyone can do it. There are basically no restrictions on this. Anyone can do it. It's very seamless. Most of the clients, such as the Sui wallet and other types of wallets, will let you do this, out of the box. Now, what happens when you stake your Sui tokens? Interestingly, in Sui, we have sort of this Sui has this very safe design in that the Sui tokens actually never leave your address. The only thing that happens is when you decide to stake a given amount of Sui tokens to a validator of choice, those Sui tokens will be wrapped into what's called a stake Sui object. Those stake Sui object tokens are now living in your address, but they count as if they were delegated to a certain validator of choice. And that stake Sui object will also take into account like the epoch at which those tokens were delegated at. And that's very important for doing the accounting into the stake rewards that are earned throughout the staking process, as we'll go through in a second. But the very nice property about the staking flow is that because the stake Sui tokens never leave your address, a user can participate in the staking process without losing custody of those tokens. So there is no sense in which a smart contract can be hacked or like something can happen in which like a validator can steal your tokens if if they act maliciously. That is something that just cannot happen in Sui, and so it's sort of very elegant because it lets everyone participate in upholding the network security while also being able to ensure that their own security of their Sui tokens remain in their wallet. So that's a quick overview about what's stake or where do the stake Sui tokens go. But going a little bit more deeply, and I realize that this slide has sort of a wall of text, but this is actually useful because if you want to go really in detail, this is sort of some of the math that you would use in order to sort of do the accounting for stake rewards. So how does Sui work in terms of like accounting for the rewards that come in and how much an initial amount of Sui that is staked earn rewards? How do you do that accounting? So Sui's design basically uses staking pools. And if essentially what it does is it, at the validator level, throughout each epoch, a validator pool is sort of the amount of Sui that has been deposited as principal to that validator in order to stake, plus the rewards that that validator pool has been earned up to that period. And basically, if you do a little bit of calculation in terms of like how much Sui was initially deposited to that pool relative to how much is sitting at the pool at any given moment, that gives you what we called an exchange rate. And what you're going to see is as time goes by and that validator pool starts adding or earning more and more stake rewards, that exchange rate is going to start appreciating. Why is it going to start appreciating? Well, because in Sui, the network never slashes stake principal. So if you deposit Sui in order to stake, that stake will never be slashed. And stake rewards can be slashed, but the worst that can happen is that if they were to be slashed, a validator pool will simply not make any rewards throughout that epoch. So that means that a validator pool will always either receive a positive amount of stake rewards or at most 0 stake rewards if they were to be fully slashed. In terms of the exchange rate, what that means is that the exchange rate will also always have to be appreciating over time. And in practice, the way it works is that when a validator initializes and begins operations, that exchange rate is initialized to a value of 1. And as that validator pool starts earning more stake rewards, that exchange rate is going to go from 1 to larger numbers that are going to incorporate the rewards that are accrued throughout that time period. And the nice thing about that is because then you can use this exchange rate that updates at every epoch boundary every time the staking, the network closes an epoch and stake rewards are distributed to the different validators. And thus, if you wanted to understand how many stake rewards a given validator pool has made over a given amount of time or like a given amount of epochs, you only need to calculate the relative ratio of those two exchange rates to understand what the return on that staking pool is. And so that's very useful because it lets you calculate, one, if you want to understand the change in stake rewards between one epoch and another, you just calculate the ratio of exchange rates between 2 consecutive epochs. But if you want to do a more complicated calculation, like understand, how many stake rewards has a staking pool at a given validator, how many rewards has that pool made over, say, the last month, the last 30 epochs, then you just calculate the relative exchange rate between those, between the 2 epochs that have, 2 epochs with 30 epochs in the middle. So for example, it could be epoch 150 and 120, or epoch 90 and epoch 60, so on and so forth. So this is sort of a very elegant form of accounting that is going to let everyone understand how many rewards a validator pool is making. And it's sort of one of the critical parts that would need to be taken into account when building a liquid staking protocol, because a liquid staking protocol will let users deposit their stake Sui objects. And since different validators in different epochs have different exchange rates, this accounting needs to be used in order to figure out how that liquid staking pool translates into liquid staking tokens given the amount of stake Sui objects that they have. This slide contains a little bit more information of that. And one sort of very nice property that the staking pool design has is that because of the virtue of working as a staking pool, as a liquidity pool, is that rewards auto compound immediately as they are received. And it requires no action from the staker. So for example, if I'm a staker today and I stake 10 Sui tokens, and then in the next epoch, I make 1 Sui in stake rewards, now I will have 11 Sui total in that staking pool that will immediately in the next epoch start counting in the form of stake in the next epoch. So my rewards are always continuously updating, compounding, and I don't need to take any action. Whenever I choose to withdraw my my original stake and accrued stake rewards at some moment in the future, that will include the total amount of stake rewards earned not only on the original principal, but also on the stake rewards earned throughout that period. So that's how the staking pool design works in Sui. Now, in terms of how this design evolved over time, I want to spend a few minutes because I think this is also important for how folks think about liquid staking. In the original design, the way that the way that staking worked in Sui is that literally when a user would deposit Sui into a validator pool, staking pool, at the end of the epoch, the user would obtain a series of delegation objects that sort of accounted for how many units of that pool the user owned, given whatever the exchange rate was at the end of that epoch. Now, that delegation object could not be given until the epoch closed because stake rewards are accrued throughout the epoch, are determined at the epoch boundary. And so you can't really know how many stake rewards a validator pool is going to earn until the epoch closes. And thus you cannot know how many Sui stake today translates into delegation objects until the epoch closes. Now, the challenge with this design is that it put a lot of work, a lot of heavy work on Sui whenever the epoch closed, because it means that if a lot of people staked throughout the epoch, there were all these transactions that had to occur at the epoch boundary in which these delegation objects were given to folks in order to determine how much ownership of that validator pool they would have. And so, and we tested this during tested wave 2 back in, I think it was around January, February. And while the design worked very well from a tokenomics perspective, it was overly onerous for Sui at the protocol level in terms of how many transactions needed to occur. So that original design was deprecated and was updated into what today is called Staking V2, in which some changes have happened. The main change is that there is no more delegation object. Rather, the accounting works in a very similar way as before, except that everything happens with these exchange rates I was talking about before, in which all this accounting is done somewhat indirectly. So now the way things work is when a user stakes Sui tokens with a given validator pool, that stake Sui object records the timestamp of the epoch at which that Sui was delegated to that validator. And the validator pool itself will be tracking how the exchange rate moves over time through an auxiliary variable that is specific to each validator pool. Now, this means that with these two variables, you don't actually need the delegation objects, because as long as you can tell from a user stake Sui objects to which validator and at which epoch those Sui tokens were delegated at, and second, at the validator pool level, you can see the time series of the exchange rates. That means you can do the math that we presented in the previous slide in order to figure out how many stake rewards that those Sui tokens are accruing. That is, you're obtaining basically the same output or the same outcome that you would have with a delegation object. It's just like it's much more elegant because you actually don't need those delegation objects, and everything is done in a sort of similar accounting, but in an indirect way. Now, the really big pro of this design is that because you no longer need those delegation objects, in terms of how staking works, Sui no longer needs to process a bunch of transactions related to staking at the end of the epoch. And so now you kind of have a staking flow that is still very elegant from an incentives perspective, but that is also much lighter for Sui's operations. And this is sort of why we went into staking V2. However, one challenge with this design is that because of this sort of indirect way of accounting, today, if a user wishes at some point to unstake their Sui tokens, that user will immediately be able to obtain their Sui liquidity in the form of the principal that they originally staked, but also the rewards that have been accrued so far, except for the current epoch. So for example, if I'm in Epoch 35 and I decide to unstake today, I will earn all the rewards accrued up till the end of Epoch 34, but I will no longer earn the rewards of Epoch 35. And the reason for that is because if I unstake during Epoch 35, well, so we can't tell how many stake rewards will be accrued in total throughout Epoch 35 because Epoch 35 hasn't finished. And thus, the only way to unstake and obtain immediate liquidity is by foregoing those rewards of the epoch at which you unstake. Now, in principle, this might not be a huge problem because epochs are relatively short; they're only 24 hours, and so if you lose the rewards for just like the last 24 hours at most, it's not the end of the world. Still, it's not the most. It is a little bit of a wrinkle, and the bigger challenge is that if you ever wanted to implement something like on-bonding periods or cooling down periods, it becomes very complicated. So one thing that's on the roadmap but that hasn't been implemented yet is something called Staking V3, in which it will be a combination of what we had in Staking V1, but also with some of the indirect accounting that we have in Staking V2. In particular, the difference will be is that when a user wants to unstake Sui tokens, now they will submit a withdrawal request. They will not be able to obtain immediate liquidity, but instead they will obtain a withdrawal receipt. And once the current epoch ends, they will be able to redeem that withdrawal receipt for the Sui principal and accrued rewards. This has the best of both worlds because it has a very clean accounting. It lets people obtain all the stake rewards even until the latest epoch, but it doesn't have the high operational burden that Staking V1 had, because now instead of Sui automatically processing all unstakes at the epoch boundary, here people need to individually redeem their withdrawal receipts whenever they want to. And so that really reduces the burden on Sui and also potentially enables the ability to include unbonding or cooling down periods, which can be actually very important for network security purposes because it prevents the staking distribution from experiencing very sharp changes in the stake distribution during moments of market volatility. And that's just something that's very important for Sui's operations to remain stable over time. Okay, so I want to add a few more comments on stake and unstake details on the user journey. And after this, I think it would be a good idea to move to Q&A, and people can ask questions if they have any. So simple question, when does my stake deposit request take effect? If I, as a user, stake today, those stake Sui tokens will start counting at the epoch of the boundary. Remember, everything, in specifically the exchange rates, which are really important to making sure how to do the stake reward accounting in Sui, everything happens at the epoch boundary because those are when the exchange rates update, because that's when the network can tell how many stake rewards were accrued throughout the network. So if I'm a Sui staker and I stake in epoch 35, that Sui will start counting as new stake starting in epoch 36. Again, in terms of unstaking, that is more immediate. If I unstake right now, I will get the immediate liquidity of my initially deposited stake Sui plus the accrued rewards, except for the current epoch. That, as mentioned, was in the last slide. That will change once we move to staking V3. So how is the exchange rate for each validator pool calculated? Let's go a little bit deeper into the meat of this. So the exchange rate is basically just the previous exchange rate times the relative change of stake rewards in the validator pool. So at any given moment, if a validator pool say has 100 Sui in it, and then that staking pool makes 5 rewards throughout that epoch, well, that means that the exchange rate should be updated by that sort of relative proportion. In this case, if we have 100 stake and there is 5 Sui that come in as stake rewards, you would multiply the previous epoch exchange rate times 1.05, where that 0.5 comes by dividing that 5 that was obtained in the form of stake rewards over the original stake in that staking pool of 100. And that that shows you that you can do this sort of very simple math to calculate how the exchange rate moves over time. And it always goes up because stake rewards can never be negative. And so the exchange rate is always going to be appreciating, and sort of tells you the ratio of exchange rates across two epochs, or any two epochs, tells you the validator pool's return in terms of stake rewards throughout that epoch. Now, where do stake rewards come from? Stake rewards in Sui are paid to different entities in different proportions. The majority of stake rewards are paid to stakers. That's regular people that are staking through their Sui wallet or any other Sui client. A small share of those, however, are paid to validators in the forms of validator commissions, because this is sort of how validators earn money, in terms of they provide a service by operating the network on behalf of users. And so if you stake to a validator, you're delegating your voting power to them, but in exchange, you're paying them a small commission in rewards for their services. Now, Sui also has this thing called the storage fund, which is a way of making sure that if people save data on chain, that people actually pay for it. And because the entities that actually have to store data in Sui in order to process the network and execute transactions is the validators, there is an adjustment in how stake rewards are distributed in order to make sure that validators can reap some additional stake rewards whenever the storage fund is big, so that they can cover their costs of actually holding that data in storage. Okay. How does the staking process differ for validators relative to third-party Sui token holders? Well, actually, the process is exactly the same. If a validator wants to stake Sui that it owns itself, it will do it through a client, and its Sui will be treated just as that of any third party. The only difference is that validators in their address will also be airdropped additional stake Sui objects over time as they start making commissions and rewards that accrue to the storage fund. In terms of accounting, there's a couple of slides at the end, so I'm going to skip this question for now, but you'll be able to see that in a second. Okay, so those are the main questions I wanted to provide some clarity on in terms of the staking flow. And a lot of these details, I think, if you're building liquid staking, are really important and are things that you're going to need to master in order to understand how to build a liquid staking protocol that is very efficient, provides a good user experience, and is sort of aligned with providing a secure staking process for Sui and delivers a good financial service for the ecosystem. I want to delve a little bit more into the tokenomics in terms of where these stake rewards actually come from. Now, stake rewards in Sui come from two different places. One is there's a share of Sui tokens that were programmatically reserved when mainnet launched in order to be issued as stake subsidies over the beginning of Sui's existence. Now, these stake subsidies are programmatically locked. They're distributed every single epoch, and they're really built there to subsidize the network in these early phases when there's not as much activity as you would have whenever the Sui network is at scale and has hundreds of millions of users in the future. And so stake subsidies is important today, but it will eventually go away. Rather, in the future, what we'll need to sustain Sui is gas fees. And gas fees are simply the transaction fees collected throughout each epoch that people pay for interacting with the protocol. Today, stake subsidies make up the majority of stake rewards, and gas fees make up a small proportion. But as time goes by and stake subsidies fall, gas fees will start making up the difference as more people start using Sui and start paying more fees as more transactions come in. As I said earlier, stake rewards, once they're distributed to a validator pool, are compounded automatically, and we discussed that previously. Any liquid staking protocol that wants to build on Sui will have to incorporate the fact that the stake Sui objects, which are the key elements that will need to be used by the liquid staking protocol in order to issue a liquid staking token, will have to incorporate that fact that all stake rewards are automatically compounded. As I said before, most of the stake subsidies will be given out throughout the early years of Sui. Gas fees, digging in a little bit deeper, every transaction pays, in terms of gas fees, the gas units that are required to process and execute that transaction times the gas price. And the gas price in Sui is a fairly rich model with an item called the reference gas price that is set by validators at the beginning of every epoch. And basically, it's a way of constructing a market for what the gas price should be relative to where the Sui token price is. So, for example, the Sui token price falls during a given amount of time, you would expect the reference gas price to move in the opposite direction, because now every Sui unit or every mist, which is one billionth of Sui, is worth less. Oppositely, if the Sui token price were to increase during a certain amount of time, you would expect the reference gas price to fall, because the fact that Sui is worth more means that less Sui needs to be paid in the form of gas in order to cover the cost of a validator in order to make the network successful. Throughout testnet wave 2, there was experiments that we did with validators to actually check whether this happened, and there's a blog post on the Sui Foundation going through this, but it's really interesting and it provides a lot of information on how that reference gas price works. And indeed, we were able to see that whenever in a simulated environment the Sui token price went up or down, the reference gas price would move in the opposite direction. This is important for staking because depending on where the reference gas price is, that determines how many gas fees every transaction needs to pay, and thus that determines how many stake rewards that network will need to distribute, and thus that determines how many stake rewards are distributed to every validator pool, which is an important or one of the key elements in order to build a successful liquid staking protocol. Okay, a few details on staking limits that could also be important for a liquid staking protocol is that, can someone unstake a portion of their active stake with a validator? That is, if I stake 10 Sui tokens with a validator and get a stake Sui object with 10 Sui in it, can I simply unstake half of it? No, you can't actually do this directly. You can. It's all or nothing. Either you entirely unstake that stake Sui object, or you don't do it. And that is critical for liquid staking, because in liquid staking, again, what's going to be backing those liquid staking tokens are going to be the stake Sui object. However, in Sui, you can split and smash together different stake Sui objects. So if you wanted to partially unstake, you can do it, except you need to do an extra step. The first step is you need to split a stake Sui object such that one of the two, or one of the various objects into which you split it to, is the right amount that you want to unstake, and then you would entirely unstake that sort of new stake Sui object that contains only the amount of Sui that you want to withdraw. This is again going to be something that's really important for liquid staking protocols, because if people come to your protocol and want to redeem any amount of the liquid staking token, then you're going to have to do some operations with the stake Sui objects in terms of splitting or merging them in order to make sure that you can redeem the right amount of stake Sui objects for any given amount of liquid staking tokens. And that is something that, again, as sort of projects start building their different protocols for doing this, we'll have to figure out exactly how they do that, and it'll be an interesting problem to solve. Another restriction that's going to be important is that the minimum amount that can be staked is 1. So a stake Sui object at most can be split into 1 Sui. How does this relate to voting power and consensus, or like how does a validator stake? Well, in Sui, voting power is split into 10,000 units. And so if you look at the stake distribution, which is basically how much stake each validator has relative to the total amount of stake staked across Sui, that proportion is used is distributed according to those percentages in up to 10,000 units. And each validator, this is sort of what will determine their voting power. At most, a validator can only have 10% of the voting power. And if a validator were to have a stake share that is beyond 10%, then the validator will be capped. It will not be able to execute a voting power beyond 10%. And also this affects stake rewards, because the validator will not be able to accrue more than 10% of the stake rewards that are accruing to the network throughout a given epoch. So this is very important to keep in mind, because first of all, this is an important lever to encourage decentralization, but it's very important to keep in mind because if a validator were to grow too big in the sense that it has too big of a staking share, then in that situation, the stake rewards that that validator earns is actually going to be smaller than it would be if this cap didn't exist, because this 10% cap is ensuring that that validator cannot get more than 10% of stake rewards, regardless of how big it is. And so that's a little detail that will also need to be worked into the liquid staking protocol when figuring out how to do the accounting. Okay, I'm actually not going to go into the slide. I'm going. This is actually this is just in terms of like how the staking rewards accounting works. It's all provided in the documentation in the website in the for Sui. I'm not going to cover it because it's like fairly technical, but it really just covers how stake rewards are actually distributed in practice to validators and stakers. And there's a lot of elements such as the proportion of stake that a validator holds, the outcome of a tallying rule, which I'll cover in a second, the validator commission, the percent of stake owned by a validator itself, the size of the storage fund that essentially determines exactly how much rewards go to a validator, to a delegator, and to different validators and delegators at different validators. So again, I'm not going to cover this because it's a little bit too in the weeds, I think, for today's presentation. But this is actually pretty important if you want to understand how stake rewards are distributed across the network. And again, this is all available in the Sui documentation website. Finally, this part on validators includes some information on how to set the reference gas price, which I already described, and more interesting, what is the tallying rule? Now, the tallying rule currently is a social equilibrium way of enforcing good behavior among the validator set. Essentially, the validators are always monitoring each other, and if validators suddenly realize that one validator is not doing their job, they can choose to slash the rewards accruing to that validator. And the way they do it is through this functionality called the tallying rule. Essentially, what validators do is at every epoch, if they vote and decide whether every other validator should get their full stake rewards or whether they should be slashed, and if a quorum of validators, which is 2/3 of the stake, decides that a validator should be slashed, that validator will lose its stake rewards. Now, the tallying rule is something to encourage good behavior across the validator set. It's currently mostly enforced through the social equilibrium because validators literally need to vote in order to enforce it. But in the future, it's likely that this will be upgraded into a more automatic process in which the network itself can monitor certain metrics at the validator level. And if any validators start falling behind across critical operational metrics, then those validators will have their stake rewards slashed. This is important for liquid staking too when doing the accounting, because the liquid staking protocol will need to take into account that some stake Sui objects may actually not be accruing rewards in certain epochs, especially whenever the tallying rule is used. Again, the tallying rule is probably something that will not be used very often because it's really it's more of a monitoring, and it's more of a one of these mechanisms that exist to ensure that everyone does their job without having to actually use it in practice. But there is obviously a world in which the validators do decide to slash other validators, especially when they're not performant. Okay, that's basically what I wanted to cover today. I know it was a lot, but I hope this was useful. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to answer any questions if people have any.
Awesome. So yeah, first and foremost, thank you so much for very incredible presentation, Alonso. And you said we can share the slides, so I'll be sure to like share the slides and like the Tsunami Riders and the Liquid Staking Telegram, because I think that's like, full of like really important information that hackers should know. And yeah, I'm looking at the comments right now. We can give it a few minutes. If any comments roll through, we can answer them accordingly. Maybe give it just like another minute or so. Okay, yeah, looks like there's no questions. So yeah, Alonso, thank you so much for your time. Like I said, I learned a lot just now. Incredibly like informative presentation, and yeah, I'll be sure to get this information over to our hackers as well. Thank you again.
Cool, thank you, and I hope this was useful to folks, and really excited to see your submissions for the Liquid Staking hackathon. It's going to be a lot of fun. Yeah, good luck, and excited to see those submissions.
Awesome. All right. Goodbye. Have a good one.